Um, you mentioned in the book that bow hunters, I didn't know there were that many. I know it exists, but I didn't know there were that many, but that they are targeted maybe even more than people with firearms. There's one case, Aaron Hedges.
And the bow hunter stories are the strangest stories in the books. I can honestly say that for some reason, either they're not found or they're found under conditions that are just totally bizarre. Aaron's case is one of the most bizarre, and a super experienced hunter, and this isn't a joke. He was hunting in the Crazy Mountains. That's the name of them in Montana. And the location was he was about 20 miles north of Billings. He was with three friends, and they took the Cottonwood Lake Trailhead into the Crazies. And all three in the group were carrying radios to communicate. So somehow during the day, this has happened about September 7th of 2014, he got separated somehow. And this is another element that I talk about in the books, is somehow, and it's unexplained how, and nobody really knows how, but they get separated. The group gets separated. Well, he gets on the radio, and he says that he missed the trail back to their camp, and he was going to go on to a place called Sunlight Lake. And he knew this location really well because there was a cache of supplies there from the previous year that he had placed, the sleeping bag, food, etc. He was going to grab some of those supplies and meet him back to camp that night. Well, the following morning, he still hadn't made it back to camp, but his friends knew he was super well adjusted to the outdoors. They didn't worry. He figured he was just going to spend the night there, hunt for some elk, and meet him the next day. And he had the supplies, and he was armed with his bow, and he knew the area super well. Well, the pair of friends that day killed an elk. They brought it back to their camp, and when Aaron didn't arrive that Monday night, the friends started to become concerned. And the friends that night stayed in position. The next morning they wake up, and they start looking for Aaron. Well, that night they didn't find him, and they got real concerned, and they left, and they started to look for assistance. So on Wednesday, they made it out of the mountains. They called Aaron's wife, reported him as missing, and they called the sheriff. Now, the press did state that the delay in reporting could have played a part in the search. Well, the men were hunting on the western side of the Crazies in Park County. This is important because the Crazies cover several different counties. So they were on the western side. On the eastern side of the mountains is Sweetgrass County. Well, the initial report stated that Aaron was lost on the western side of the mountains, and Park County took control of the search. And by the time Park County started the search, snow had started to fall, and there were soon 2 feet of snow on the ground as the search party started to go into the field. So there was a 3-day delay in getting Aaron reported missing, and then a 2-day delay in getting people into the field to search. Now, 5 days of inclement weather, chances are you're probably dead, and unless you're super well situated in the mountains and have the clothing and perseverance to survive. Well, the Park County Sheriff soon realized that Aaron could possibly have been on the border with Sweetgrass County, so he called for their assistance. Well, there's a September 28th article in the Livingston Enterprise that stated 2 weeks earlier. Now, this is obviously, he disappears on the 7th. This article's on the 28th. So they're saying on about the 14th, a week after Aaron disappears, searchers are in the field, and they found a pair of boots and a camelback, and both of them were identified as belonging to Aaron. Now, one search and rescue worker makes a statement in the article that barefoot, you're not going to go and travel far, so we searched a 1/4-mile radius, and we found nothing. So this was next to a creek. Search and rescue finds his 2 boots and a camelback. Now there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. You're the search and rescue people. You know Aaron's not going far, if he went anywhere. So they brought 20 different canine teams into that area to see if they could pick up a scent. They found nothing. They brought in 7 equestrian teams. They found nothing. They looked for tracks leaving the area. They found nothing. 50 ground searchers found nothing. Now, they brought in a helicopter with forward-looking infrared, and they found nothing, meaning that they were looking for something emitting heat on the ground. And if you're If you die one day, you're going to emit heat for a couple days. The National Guard flew a series of sorties. They found nothing. 15 days after the search started, they found nothing, and it was terminated. Now, 9 months later, the case takes an unusual turn, to say the least. 2 men were working on repairing a fence in Sweetgrass County. One man was repairing the fence, and his dad was just kind of walking around keeping him company, visiting. Well, his dad finds a bow, a backpack, and an orange vest. And his dad said he's looking at this stuff, and he's thinking he's going to find a body because it must have been a bear that killed someone right here. And they looked around. They didn't find anything other than just this equipment. Well, the men called the sheriff, and it wasn't before long that the sheriff ID'd the property as Aaron's. Now, here's where it's almost beyond understanding. The location where the vest and the backpack was found was 15 cross-country air miles in deep snow from point to point from where Aaron's boots were found. Now, the items were found 2 miles from a ranch house. They searched the area intensively where they found this backpack, and they found nothing.
So there's no way he walked 15 miles with no boots on.
Well, let me get you to the part where they interviewed the lieutenant. So, remember what the SAR worker said. He said, well, Aaron couldn't travel far from the point they found the boots. That's the reason they just...
I'll tell you what, Dave, I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry. The music is telling us we need to take a break.
So, the locations where all this were found were pretty identifiable. And I looked on a geological survey map, and it looks like it's just over 13 air miles point to point. One article said it was 15. I got it at 13. Now, if you talk about any kind of survival expert, to go through rugged mountains, it's never point to point. It's at least double, sometimes triple, because you're going up, down, sideways. And in this instance, in the middle of winter, chances are he's not going to be crossing creeks and rivers, so it makes it a longer trip. Well, they interviewed a corporal named Greg Todd, who's the head of the Sweetgrass County Search and Rescue, and they asked him, with what you have in front of you, what he thought might have happened. And the quote he gave was, "That is the million-dollar question," and that's all he'd say. Well, then they went to Lieutenant Alan Ronenberg of the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Department, and in the Montana Pioneer Press of October 3rd, 2015, they asked him what he thought might have happened. And I quote him, he said, everything from he got turned around and got off the trail, got caught in the storm, passed away off the trail from hypothermia, to he's in Mexico somewhere, to UFOs got him, there's literally a full list, end of quote. Essentially, they have no idea.
In that same section of your book, California, the Central Coast, you've got another, just a heartbreaking case about a girl named Anna Christian Waters, Half Moon Bay.
Yeah, and that's a case that I grew up in a suburb of San Jose. This happened about 30 miles from my house. And this one is a heartbreaking one, to say the least. But it fits the profile to a T. And Anna was living in an area just outside of Half Moon Bay, in a very rural area at the time. Now, there's multi-million-dollar homes in this area. There's some rock stars that live there, and a lot of Silicon Valley, very wealthy people live in this one little valley. But Anna and her mom lived in this kind of rundown area at the time. It's beautiful. I would have lived there. And she went to school, and her mom was an assistant in her class. Her father was a physician that lived in San Francisco but was separated from his mom. This area is about 15, 20 miles south of an area called Devil's Slide, famous area between Half Moon Bay and San Francisco. This actually occurred on a street called Purissima Creek Road in San Mateo County, California. Anna came home from school, and there was a lot of weird things that happened this day in this little valley. One thing that made the newspapers was that a chicken went crazy and attacked a worker in the area, and the worker had to kill it. Another story was that a woman was exercising her horse just up the street from where Anna disappeared, and she heard strange noises in a bush right across from where she was. Again, she never saw anything, but it was just strange. Anna comes home from school, goes into the backyard. there's a creek flowing through her backyard. She's playing in the backyard for a few minutes. She comes in, takes off her red raincoat, goes back outside. Her mom said all of a sudden things went really quiet, and she knew something was wrong. She went outside and she couldn't find Anna. And there's a big search, didn't find anything. Sheriff shows up, big search, doesn't find anything. The water level in this creek is up a little bit higher than normal because of winter rains. And initially people thought that Anna went into the creek and maybe flowed downstream and drowned. Well, give it to the San Mateo County Sheriffs. They pulled out all the stops, and there were big blockages in the creek from wood and fallen timber and things, and they made the determination there's no way she could have gotten more than a half a mile, even if she was deceased floating in that creek, and there's no way she could have made it to the ocean, which was miles away. But as they brought in search and rescue dogs, the dogs go into the backyard and start to follow a scent upstream, which makes no sense because there's a gate in that area where Anna couldn't get past. Make a very long story short, they looked for this girl for days, months, years. It's still an open case. They never found her. Again, her mom wrote a great book about searching. It's called Searching for Anna. And the details in it are just heart-wrenching, but they fit this to the T, where everyone's scratching for some answer, but there's nothing to be found, and this girl should have been found because there was no place to go.
Let's talk about some of the new patterns that you wanted to discuss tonight. You sort of have an outline in mind that you shared with me. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know I'm smart enough to get out of the way. So I just want you to go ahead and explain the patterns that you've seen and why our audience should know about them.
So sometimes when I write about a case, I've got a gut feeling that it's going to fit. So I'll exert a lot of effort to understand it and get more documents. And last year I wrote about this incident, and nobody in radio and all the 100-plus interviews I've done has ever keyed on this, and I think it's important to talk about. A man named Jonathan Miles Robinson. He was 6'5" tall, 23 years old. He was from Great Britain. And every Christmas, he and his family went to Wengen, W-E-N-G-E-N, Switzerland, for their holiday. And Wengen sits at the bottom of Mount Eiger in Switzerland. The elevation of this little city is only like 4,000 feet. There's 1,300 year-round residents, about 5,000 summer residents. And in the wintertime, it swells to 10,000 because of the skiing. And for some reason, in the early 1900s, British people migrated there and set up ski clubs there. So it's a big hub for tourists from Great Britain. And this little community in the wintertime is only accessed one way, and that's by a rack railway system from a city called Lauterbrunnen. And after midnight, the track railway doesn't operate, and there is no other way in and out. And I guess they'd have to call for helicopter evac in a medical situation, but you can't walk out of there, and there are no cars in this little tiny city. There's just little golf carts. Well, on December 21st, 2009, Miles was with his family at the Eiger Hotel, having dinner. They were drinking, they were having fun, and they went to this place called the Blue Monkey Bar. And they were playing pool, more drinking, and at about 2 in the morning, everybody decided to split up. And one of the family friends was a female, and Miles said, "Hey, I'll just walk her down the street here to her hotel." And there was CCTV cameras on the street that picked he and her walking to the hotel. He went in at about 2:20 in the morning, and she said that he left the hotel at 2:50 in the morning. And one camera caught him leaving that hotel where she was at about 2:51. And it was no more than 200 yards from that hotel where he was leaving to his hotel. And he disappeared. And the parents stated adamantly this was 100% out of his character. He was a college grad. He had a finance degree. He had a great job in London. And his mom was a senior official in the British Skiing Association, and she really rallied a lot of support to help find her son. And they went as much as going door to door in this little city asking people if they could search their house. Well, the police brought in canines, and they never found a trackable scent anywhere. And the police also went door to door. And then the family on the 28th of December decided, we're not getting anywhere with this. So they brought in a special team of searchers that they hired. And just after that, they were in a town. They were in the town just outside of Lauterbrunnen, and the searchers were looking streets, alleyways, and at about in the mid-afternoon hours, they thought they saw something at the bottom of this cliff in Lauterbrunnen. And they had a couple guys go down, and they went down, and they found his body dead. Now, what that in and of itself would sound pretty suspicious. But one thing I write about in my cases is that when people are found under unusual profiled cases that I write about, they're missing clothing, but more times than not, they're missing shoes. And this was the middle of winter when Miles disappeared, and he's found at the bottom of a cliff that's inaccessible at the time of the morning when he disappeared, and he's missing shoes. And his cell phone stopped sending a signal at 5 a.m. on the morning he disappeared. At 3:26 in the morning, there was a message sent from his phone to the first name in the directory in his phone. Now, when you talk to people who are really good with cell phones, sometimes if you drop your phone, it'll either automatically dial 911 or it'll dial the first number in your directory. And that's what happened on this case. So more than likely, at 3:26 a.m., he went off that cliff and died. Now, everybody understand, there's no way to get from Wengen to Lauterbrunnen in the middle of the morning like that. And he disappears. Now, the coroner ruled an open verdict, meaning he's not going to rule out foul play. He did say that Miles was missing his shoes and socks. His blood alcohol level was 0.20, twice over, almost 3 times the legal limit of driving. But all of the cameras that showed him when he was leaving the various hotels, he wasn't staggering. He was walking completely normally. And it showed that the autopsy showed he had many, many broken bones. And there was also some strange things regarding hypothermia and paranoia. And an author, I won't name him, but he has this saying, local reports for local consumption. And what they wanted to do with this is just quell the community. And when you read the online articles about this, their family says several times, can somebody please tell me how my son got from point to point in the middle of the night? And why is everybody ignoring this? And on its face, that is a strange case.
He was pretty messed up. There was an autopsy or 2 autopsies or something like that. I mean, he was smashed, like as if somebody picked him up. And this is just me surmising here, but it's almost like he was picked up and then dropped.
It does sound like that. And there's
broken bones, right?
I'm sorry?
Broken bones, right?
Broken bones, yes. In fact, I think there was multiple serious breaks, and the final cause of death, I think they were going to try to levy it to a fractured skull, but there was never any mention of cerebral damage other than bones to his legs and et cetera. But so I wrote about that, and then son of a gun, earlier this year, a man named Kieran Flux, 18-year-old guy from the Isle of Wight, another UK Brit, he was with his family at a place called Val d'Isère in France. It's right near the Italian border. He was an experienced snowboarder. He attended college at the Isle of Wight. Both these guys, so Miles was a college grad, and Flux was in college. And he arrived with his dad and other family members, and they were staying in a chalet on January 4th, 2015. On the 5th, he went snowboarding with his family, and then afterwards went out drinking in Val d'Isère. And on the 6th at 1:30 in the morning, he's seen walking out of a bar in town. Well, the morning of the 6th, his parents wake up. He's not in the house. They look around. They call his cell. Nothing. He's reported as a missing person. Police search the town. Family searches the town, the mountain area. Nothing's found on the 6th. On the 7th, the police put a helicopter up, and they find his body 2 miles away, northwest of town, in this is their wording, in a gorge. And in the Telegraph newspaper on the 8th, it says it was understood that Mr. Flux's body was found at a steep and isolated spot in the Gorges de la Dalle, between La Dalle area of the resort and Chevreau Lake. Some articles state that among the questions police investigators were looking at was how the teenager ended up in such a remote spot, and they claimed he froze to death. And they said, this is interesting, the body was frozen solid. And they said that he fell at least 70 feet. Articles state this is the key part, articles state he was wearing a pair of jeans, T-shirt, a jumper, and a jacket. There was never any mention if he was or wasn't wearing shoes. Police stated they were still investigating the case, and there was no release at this time by the cause of death. But they're going to surmise it to be probably hypothermia and freezing. No autopsy reports have been released at this time.
Dave, I want to come back to this. Obviously, we need to take a break here, but I want you to draw the comparisons between that one and the first case you said, and I think you've got one after that. Dave Paulides, you mentioned some of the details about this guy, Kieran Flux, and the similarities to Jonathan Miles Robinson. What jumps out at you there as being a little bit too eerie for comfort?
So off the top, they're both smart young men, either in college or attending college. Obviously pretty well-to-do because they're at a nice resort with family. Both of them had been drinking alcohol. Both of them were alone. Both at a ski resort in Europe. Both guys were extremely athletic. No witnesses to what happened, and there was no explanation from anyone about how they could arrive at where they were eventually found. And both were found in a very isolated area. No explanations.
I remember when you started the research, you were a little bit wary about cases where people disappear and there's buildings and a lot of other folks around. You didn't want to jump into urban disappearances because of so many other complicated factors. Could these guys have just been, they got into a beef with somebody an argument, who held them at gunpoint, threw them in a car, and then dumped them somewhere?
Sure. If that was in New York City, I could buy into it. But the problem with Miles, there was no way to get point to point. And it's not easy getting off that mountain undetected because the only way you can get to and from it is off this little rail car line, and everyone sees you leaving. You're under CCTV. They knew he hadn't left. No other way during the middle of winter. During the summer, there's a trail that goes from town to town, and I was reading that it takes anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to make that trip during the summer. During the winter, it's an impossible trek. So, you got to use logic and common sense here. The man didn't walk point to point, and it happened in the middle of the night, so your guess is as good as mine how he got there.
No way a helicopter came in because somebody would have heard it.
Exactly.
And then you say there's another one that jumped out at you that's not all that dissimilar.
So we actually have a YouTube page where we produced a few videos, and this is one of them, and it involves a physician named Dr. James McGrogan, 39 years old. He went missing on March 14th, 2014 in Vail, Colorado. And for the people that have been to Vail before, on one side of the freeway is the ski resort. When you look at the other side of the freeway, there's a mountain very steep that has a trail that goes up to a little cabin up top. And he went with a couple of other physicians into the area in the middle of winter, and they were going to backpack into this area and spend the night. Well, he was originally from Wisconsin, moved to Mishawaka, Indiana, to the St. Joseph Regional Medical Center, where he was an emergency room doctor. This guy is probably has a different profile than most physicians because he really, really wanted to be a physician. And the first couple times he couldn't get into medical school, third time he got in. And not only was he a smart guy, but he was also a marathon runner, ultra determined in whatever he did. Now, one of the things that I talk about in my last couple of books is a profile point of runners. And there's been a lot of people, marathon runners, long-distance runners, that have disappeared under unusual circumstances. And McGrogan fit in my book under two profiles, one being super smart physician and the other being a marathon runner. Well, he left with other physicians from Indiana for a boys' weekend up on the trail. They went into Denver, and he rented what's called a split snowboard from this shop in downtown Denver. I actually went out and I interviewed the guys that rented him the stuff. And then they went up to Vail, spent the night, got up early the next morning, and there's a trail that's very compacted snow that you make your way up the hillside to this one location they were headed. McGrogan was ultra prepared. He didn't take any chances. This guy had an avalanche beacon, he had GPS, he had a cell phone with extra batteries, tent, food. He had everything you could imagine to survive anything. Well, as they were going up this trail, it's steep. You're at about 9,000 feet when you start. The other physicians were getting tired. McGrogan was in shape. He goes, "Hey, I'll meet you at the next stop. I'm just going to keep going." So he keeps hiking. Well, the guys get to the next stop. He's not there. And they said, well, maybe he's just kept going. Maybe he's going to meet us at Iceman Hut and their location that they were headed. And by 5 o'clock that night, they get to the hut, and everyone says, no, nobody ever came up here. Nobody ever got here. Nobody's seen anyone. So one of the physicians goes back down, gets a hold of the police, and that's what started the search effort. Well, right away, the search and rescue really put forth a huge effort on this. They put 2 helicopters into the sky. There were over 1,000 search and rescue hours spent on the trail. They brought canines on the trail. Every trail that left the snow trail that they were on was tracked to the end of where it was. They found nothing. And if you left this main trail and you decided to cross country, say, there wasn't a lot out there in the way of trees and foliage. And if you did make your way through this snowfield of several mountains, it'd be like a snowplow going along, and you would be so easily detected from a helicopter, it'd be ridiculous. But they saw nothing. Now, about 4.5 miles from where he was last seen, over 2 mountains, 4.5 air miles, some people were in an area called Booth Creek Falls. This is on April 3rd. He disappeared on March 14th. They're there, and this area had already been flown over and searched many times. These people walked up it, they were looking around, and they find his body laying in this frozen creek. And they call search and rescue, and the coroner goes up, takes control of the body, brings it down. He's wearing a helmet, he's wearing pants, he's wearing shirt. He's not wearing gloves, he's not wearing a coat, and he's not wearing boots. He's missing 20 days. He's found in an area that had been searched before. The cell phone that was found in his backpack was activated by the coroner's investigator. It was found to be operable. And in the report, it stated that there were many areas along the path where his cell phone would have worked, and I know because I've been there, there were several areas around that location where you could actually see Vail all the way down the mountain. So he could have used the phone, he didn't. Could have used his tent, his backpack, his food. Nothing was used. When I went down, I interviewed. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Please continue.
So when we went out and interviewed the company that rented him the equipment, I asked him, I said, hey, you guys do this all the time. I mean, what kind of sense does it make that he would have gone off the trail and did this over 2 mountain ranges, up 1,000 feet, down 1,000 feet, up 1,200 feet? He goes, hey, nobody's going to do that. We can't even do that. And he says he had all that equipment. Why didn't he just hang out? And, you know, there was bad weather at some point during a couple days after he disappeared, and they had to call off search and rescue. that was the case, he would have whipped out his tent. He would have spent a couple of nights just bundled up, nice and warm, and with food. He didn't do any of that. And I asked the guys, I said, so what's your explanation that he wasn't wearing boots? And the three guys in the shop looked at each other like I was talking French or something. And they said, what are you talking about? They said, I said, he wasn't wearing boots. Oh, you mean when they did the autopsy? I said, no. When they found him on the mountain, they didn't find his boots on him, and they never did find the boots. And they said, that's impossible. I said, no, that's the truth. And they stated that they had talked to the coroner, and they got all of their equipment back except the helmet. And one of the causes of death that they listed in the report was major head trauma from a fall. Now, when I look at this mountain that he supposedly went over, again, it makes no sense because the helicopter saw no tracks. So if you think about it, all these guys were essentially in or very near a major ski resort, a world-class ski resort. All disappeared alone, all males, all fell to their death, no shoes in at least 2 of the 3 cases, maybe 3 of 3, extreme remote location, no explanation on how they arrived at the point they were found, and 2 died from explained trauma. So, I mean, those are 3 cases that I just came up with in the last few years. But how strange it is that these individuals died under those circumstances.
If you look at this with your police officer's hat on as a detective, I mean, what kind of things jump out at you in terms of opportunity, for this crime? I mean, they're alone, I guess. They're nobody else around, so they're vulnerable in that sense. They can be snatched up, but motive.
Well, we sit around, and there's other law enforcement guys that I trust a lot, and we talk about this. And one guy came up with a key point. He said, Dave, they're alone, but whatever is happening here had to have been watching and waiting for that point in time, right, to make the snatch. And some people are going to say, Paulides isn't, he's out to lunch. He's claiming these people are taken. Well, these are very smart people, and you cannot logically explain how they got point to point.
Dave, let's talk about we talked about the 3 guys at the ski resorts who vanished under weird circumstances, pretty similar. You've got 3 women, similar kind of connections. Tell me about them.
So each of these women, I'll talk about the hikers because the time frames and the circumstances are really, really similar. First one is a woman that disappeared on Victoria Island in Strathcona National Park in Canada. Sylvia Apps, 69 years old. She went missing July 11th, 2014 in the Comox Valley. Super, super experienced, super good health. Left for a hike from Paradise Meadows on July 8th. She signed into a logbook and she summited Castle Craig. And she failed to arrive at a pickup point on July 13th, and that's what started the search. They found hikers that saw her just south of Castle Craig Mountain on the 11th. Now, what's interesting about this case is what they found, not what they didn't find. Searchers went in there, and in one location along a ridgeline, they found her cell phone. Another location, they found her walking poles. Another location, they found her camera, and then they found her backpack. And they don't, to quote the search and rescue people, they don't know why they were in the positions they were in, but they thought that they were going to find her imminently because of the scattered property. Now, the SAR commander, search and rescue commander, a guy named Paul Berry, this is what he said. He said, it has provided a roller coaster for both the family and the SAR teams. Clues you think are pointing in the right direction don't pan out to give you anything. And I have heard that statement many times before from other search and rescue commanders. And he says that we feel like we're getting close and then come up with nothing. It's very mystifying. He said that the lady is tough as nails, and if anyone could survive, she could. 150 searchers, canine teams, helicopters with forward-looking infrared radar. They searched until July 21st. then they gave it up. And then the search commander stated this is the first time in his career where they found all of the person's supplies and they didn't find the victim. Now, this area of Vancouver Island is beautiful, big mountains. High up on these mountains, there's no trees. It's above tree line. Weather conditions at the time were very warm, and they were concerned that she might have problems with the heat, and because it was unusually warm. Now, keep the profile in mind. She's a 69-year-old lady, July 11th, 2014, in Canada at a national park. Now, back up 12 days, June 18th, 2014, a woman named Karen Sykes. This is a really, really unusual case. She's a marathon runner. She's 70 years old. She was described by the Seattle Times as the guru of the trails. Nobody knew more about Mount Rainier National Park and its trail system than her. She hiked 2 times per week. She had written articles for local newspapers and magazines. She'd written a book about safety on the trails. This is the woman who knew everything about it. She was hiking with a friend. The friend got a little tired when on the trail they reached snow. And he said, I'm going to stop. She said she was just going to go a little further up the trail and she'd be right back. She was never seen by this guy again. They were hiking an area called Ojai Lakes Trail, and it's in the northeast corner of Rainier. The partner hiked back down the trail and eventually got a hold of rangers at 10:30 that night, and a 3-day search started. Now, it was stated that she was carrying gear to spend the night overnight in an emergency if she has to. Now, don't think that's strange, because anybody out there should be carrying some kind of emergency blanket or something to crawl into just in case you have to spend the night out somewhere. So she was doing everything right. Now, they started an intensive 3-day search. On the 3rd day, a helicopter found her in an area that was highly unusual. She had to climb up over the top of a 6,200-foot ridge, walk halfway down an adjacent valley in a gully of Boundary Creek. She was found she had to have walked through snow, and she could have turned around and followed her path back if she had been paying attention, and of course she would have been. But in the area she was in, she was found in this gully where there was no snow. In essence, she went uphill and then went downhill. She died of hypothermia. And her friend stated she was the last person in the world that would have ever gotten lost on Rainier. The Park Service even made a statement. This is their quote: "She was found in an area that was difficult to access and not commonly traveled."
And the fact that she goes up and not down, I mean, that's, you've repeated over and over again. You see that all over the place.
Yeah. And there's no, they couldn't track her. They didn't track her. They found her by helicopter, just on a general grid search of the area. Now, so we have a 69-year-old disappears on July 11th. We have a 70-year-old that disappeared 12 days later on June 18th. Now, in my book that I wrote about that I got out last year, wrote about a woman 66 years old, Geraldine Largay, disappeared on the Appalachian Trail in Maine. Her and her husband George married 32 years from Brentwood, Tennessee. Great relationship. She always wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail. Super experienced hiker, in super good shape. So her husband, George, was going to be her support system. And they would meet at designated points along the trail, and they'd spend the night sometimes. He'd restock her with food. Just exactly what a great support system should be doing. Well, her goal was to get to Mount Catendon in Baxter Park. Total trip would have been 1,150 miles, and she'd completed 950 miles. On July 22nd, 2013, she sent George a text saying she was 8 miles from her next stop and would be arriving on time on July 23rd. the 22nd, it rained heavily on the trail where Geraldine was located and where she would have texted from. Well, George shows up on the 23rd. She doesn't show up. Her husband calls Maine's Warden Service, and there's a TV show about Maine Warden Service law enforcement, and they actually did an entire show on this case a few months ago. And it was excellent because it showed how comprehensive the search was, how frustrated they were, and they found nothing. They didn't find her backpack, nothing. A 3-week search, and they went the distance on this one. And they described it as mystifying. The cell phone that she had either broke or was out of batteries because they pinged it and they didn't get anything. Now, all of these women were older in age. All were in outstanding physical condition. 2 of the 3 have never been found. The third one is somebody that would have been the last person in the world to disappear. She knew the trail system like you know the road to and from your nearest market. The idea that she disappeared and wasn't found is illogical.
You also had 3 cases that you discussed that maybe we would talk about tonight of women, ski resort women.
So these were not, these actually were women on a slightly different scale, but all of these cases mimic each other in a strange way. And first case involves a physician, Telika Patrick, 30 years old. She was working at the Borges Medical Center in Western Michigan University. She was a first-year psychiatric department resident. Went to a hotel trying to get a room to get some sleep. She couldn't. The hotel was full. She had her driver take her back to the medical center to get her car. She gets her car and she starts driving down I-94 near Lake Michigan. Her car, she doesn't show up at her residence and she doesn't show up the next day at work. They report her missing. Her car is found in a ditch with a flat tire on I-94 in Porter, Indiana. One mile the way the crow flies from Lake Michigan, and Burns Harbor is less than a half mile away. Now, one of the things I haven't talked about extensively, but I'm going to now, is that many of these cases involve water of some type. And I mean a river, a creek is nearby, a lake, a pond, the ocean. Now, in this case, Lake Michigan is right near, less than a mile away, and there's also a large pond on the other side of the fence next to the freeway where her car was. It's called Lake Charles. And the FBI, this is strange. Why the FBI got involved in this case is the million-dollar question. But they did. They say they don't get involved in missing persons cases unless it's a very young person or unless there's some kind of criminality that goes along with it. But they got involved, and they and Indiana law enforcement searched this pond for 3 days. They found nothing. Her wallet, her credit cards, and her cash were all found in her car undisturbed. Now, she went missing on December 5th, 2013. Her body is found in that same pond 5 months later, on April 6th, by a fisherman. And the family demanded to know why the canines only tracked her from her car to the shoulder of the freeway and stopped, and why her body wasn't found in the pond when it was searched. Now, there's so many parts of this that fit what I've talked about already tonight. Canines can't find the body. The scent doesn't go anywhere. The body's found in a location that had been searched thoroughly by multiple agencies. And the family's asking the same questions that you and I would ask. Now, they didn't release the autopsy on this, and that was troubling to me, because an autopsy like this is going to show the state of decomposition of the body, ocular changes to the person, was there skin slippage, how long was that body in the water, did she still have hair on her head after being in water 4 months? All these kind of things are unanswered because they won't let us see the autopsy report. And then the really good question to me is, what was the interest of the FBI in this when it was classified from the very beginning as just a missing person?
Yeah, I can see if there was a kidnapping involved, they would have jurisdiction, but That's weird. Now, I don't remember there ever being a vehicular type case in any of your previous books. So you've got another one.
Correct. I wrote about this in the last book. Letitia Marie Faust, 50-year-old woman, lived in Patrick County, Virginia. A graduate of the University of North Carolina. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep. Very, very smart lady. Considered by all people to be well-read. She had a real close relationship with her mom. Her mom was elderly. On December 9th, 2009, she was in her 1994 Honda Accord in Floyd County, Virginia, going to the pharmacy to pick up some supplies for her mom. After she did the shopping, she called her mom, told her she was coming home to drop the stuff off for her. She didn't return that night, and her mom called the sheriff. Huge search. Completely out of character for Letitia to do this. Her car was eventually found on the Blue Ridge Parkway on a street called Walnut Ridge Drive in Franklin County, described as a very, very remote area. Well, I know that if I'm in law enforcement, I find that car, I'm going to be thinking she was carjacked, murdered, and dumped. Well, they played it the right way, except that they found her wallet, all the food, her purse, her money in the car, all not disturbed. And, hold on to your hats here, the searchers found her sandals she was wearing halfway between her car and a half-acre pond that was on the property where her car was found. So the sheriff gets out 4 robotic cameras, and 3 separate dive teams search that pond, and they find nothing. And this area, there's a street, this Walnut Grove, kind of extends out into the valley, almost like an overlook. When she disappeared, it was freezing rain and snow, and that hampered the search efforts for that following week. And they stated blatantly that they had no idea what happened to her. One of the unusual things was, and think about this thoroughly, freezing rain, kind of snowing when she disappears, yet her window is rolled down on the driver's side. And I talk in the book, and I said, now what would cause you to roll down your window if you were alone? Now, if you're a female, you may not roll it down all the way if somebody walked up to the car.
Right.
But if you saw something and you were trying to hear something, maybe you would roll down the window if that felt safe.
I tell you what, Dave, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're going to need to take a short break. We'll come back, and you have a third case that relates to the 2 you just shared with us that is pretty spooky. Dave Paulides, sorry to interrupt you. You were at a pretty interesting point in the conversation about the lady who vanished and her window was rolled down. What do you make of that?
Well, I've asked a lot of people, and in trying to understand what would be my mindset for doing that with the weather being that cold. If there was any danger, meaning somebody was outside the car, I wouldn't roll down the window. But if something brought her to that location, so for me, the only thing I could think of is I would want to listen. I would want to hear better. What would be your thought on it?
Yeah, same kind of thing. Or, somebody you knew or needed help, or I don't know. You've got a third one that goes along with this, though, right?
There is. Well, one last thing on Letitia's case, the coroner could never determine what the cause of her death was. That's another one of those cases.
Huh.
But the third case involves an international case in Port Hills, New Zealand. The location where this happened is probably less than 2 miles from the ocean. May 1st, 2010, 5:45 in the morning, Emma Campbell, 29 years old. When she was working, she was on a day off, but when she worked, she was a caretaker for the disabled and the elderly. She lived with a friend in a small house in Christchurch, and her friend said she routinely took day trips into the countryside and liked and enjoyed that. And on May 1st at 5:20 a.m., she left her home in her 1994 Toyota Corona, drove to a gas station in Port Hills, and paid $30 in cash for fuel. She left the gas station at about 5:40 a.m. and drove 2.5 miles up Dyer Pass Road to its highest point. For some reason, the car went off the right side of the road on a very slight embankment There were no skid marks and very little damage to the car. The police responded when somebody said there was a car sitting halfway off the road. They searched for her, and they couldn't find her. They called her house. Her roommate said she wasn't there. They called in bigger search and rescue teams, and eventually they called in the New Zealand Army to search this hillside with their canines. Interestingly, the canines, once they started their search, they walked down this small trail, and they found her shoes just below the car on a path. And they also found her watch on the ground. Well, at this point, the police brought in a helicopter with FLIR, and they reported seeing deer on the hillside, but no body. And the New Zealand press called this one of the biggest mysteries that they had had in a long time. Now, the Army walked almost shoulder to shoulder down the embankment from the car and found nothing other than the shoes and the watch. Now, this happened May 1st, 2010. March 9th, 2012, over almost 2 years, 22 months later, a pig hunter was on the hillside where Emma had crashed the car, and he found her body on that hillside 100 yards from where the car was found. Now, police initially stated they couldn't confirm it was Emma, and they didn't explain why. And later it was determined that it was her, but they never stated what they thought the cause of death was. And they didn't explain why the body wasn't found by the canines or the Army or FLIR.
Jeez.
Emma's brother stated to the press, "It is fair to say at this time we are at a complete loss to understand what has happened."
Have there been other cases in New Zealand?
Yes. Not like this, though. Missing hikers under strange circumstances that fit the profile of what goes on in North America.
Is it a cluster? Does it count as a cluster, or they're just kind of scattered?
Sort of scattered, but, New Zealand isn't really a big country. We use a mark of 70 miles, 75-mile radius from one another, and that goes a long way in New Zealand, but I wouldn't say that there's a cluster there.
So you've got these three cases that are similar, and baffling, though. I mean, I really don't know what to make of that. It just seems like it's designed to flummox us.
Well, the strange part to me is that in all of the cases, there's extensive searches, the people aren't found, and then they are found right in that area that was searched extensively. So if the person wasn't there when they searched, and I don't believe they were, where were they?
I know in the previous volumes you had instances where clothes were found folded up or laid out as if in a ritualistic fashion. And I know in the new book you've got a case, I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's an elderly lady who was found wearing different clothes from when she disappeared.
Yeah, that's an interesting case from Central California. A woman disappeared she's a very wealthy lady. She disappeared from her kind of a rural ranch. And there was a lot of suspicion that the family was involved, and a lot of inner griping going on and finger pointing, etc. But they didn't find her for months and months. And then somebody said that they thought this lady picking berries off a berry bush in this remote location near Lake Berryessa. And she was eventually found wearing overalls, like men's overalls, and shoes, and she was found dead. But where she was for the previous 2 months, how she survived, where she got the clothes, there were a million unanswered questions with that case. But in many ways, it mimicked other elements that we see in these cases, so that's why it was included.
I would like you to address for a moment the questions that are buzzing through people's heads. That is, why isn't it a bear or a mountain lion? Why couldn't it be drug smugglers or hermits or mountain men living out there that are abducting people and taking them away somewhere?
And those are the first places everybody goes when they first hear me speak. And I like to say that when we're speaking here on the phone, you're hearing probably less than 1% of the entire story. And so I really don't want anyone to go any place in their mind that can reconcile these thoughts, because once you read the books, I've yet to find anybody that'll say, hey, this is just bogus. Everyone reads these, and they will see that there's a commonality here of elements in each of the cases. Now, one of the things about animal attacks is that if somebody is attacked, usually you have time to scream. You have time to make noise. And if it's an adult, you're usually going to fight for your life. And that fight is going to result in a huge disturbance on the ground, hair, blood, tissue, etc. There's going to be almost like a major crime scene. And dogs and canines are easily going to pick up that scent and track that down. The reality is that in all of these cases, animal attacks have been excluded. And they haven't been excluded by me. They've been excluded by search and rescue or by the law enforcement agency that's doing the case.
We are rocking and rolling with my guest, Dave Paulides, who the third volume of his book, Missing 411, is out, and it's incredible, it's chilling, it's spooky, scary. If you are familiar with the first two volumes or you've heard our interviews with Dave, you know that in many of these cases, most of these cases, in fact, the people who are found, they're either not found or they come back and they're unable to explain where they've been. They're either stunned, a lot of them have handicaps, they can't speak, or they're too young to express where they've been. But in a handful of cases, the people who are found alive, youngsters in many cases, are able to give clues to where they've been. And some of those clues are just astounding, jaw-dropping. We're going to get into one of those, the case of John Doe, where he was and what he remembers from the time when he was missing. Right after this John Doe case, missing child 3 years old, is a jaw-dropper. Tell us the story.
Well, it's interesting because I actually heard of this case years ago when it was evolving. And the reason being, this is one of those strange coincidences, is that John Doe disappeared along a creek river that I used to fish as a kid. And I'd probably been there at least 50 times. And the area is world-class fly fishing, very, very thick woods. There's a couple real famous Hollywood types that own hundreds of acres in the area. It's just pristine wilderness, great fishing. What happened was he was there with his family, and happened on October 1st, 2010. About 6:30 p.m., he disappeared. And one of the things that I didn't state earlier on is that late afternoon, early evening is the prime time for a disappearance. Anytime between, let's say, 2:30 and 6:30 or 7 at night is the time that these things seem to happen. This area of this disappearance has a very long history of strange things. I mean, people have said that there are people called Lemurians that live beneath Mount Shasta. There's been a history of Bigfoot sightings in this area. There's been tons of UFOs flying around Shasta. And I've written about a cluster in my past Western book about Shasta specifically, a cluster of disappearances. Well, this boy's 3 years old. He disappears from his parents. They immediately call the sheriff. A big search starts. And they don't find him. I mean, they looked everywhere. This area doesn't have a lot of low ground coverage. It's a lot of big trees with a lot of open area underneath. But near the rivers and things and some of the trails, there is some shrubbery, but not a lot. So anyhow, we fast forward 5 hours. At about 11:30 at night, they find this boy sitting in the middle of a bush in a thicket, and he doesn't say anything. He's taken home. Parents talk to him. He's in sort of a stunned disbelief. So finally, the next day, they get talking to him, and they said, well, explain what happened. And he goes, I really don't know. He says, I just kind of disappeared. And, well, where were you? And he tells this story that he is taken into a cave, and he thinks it's underground. And he says, I know it's dark outside, but when I'm in this cave, I could see the entrance, and it's light outside. And he says that he's with a woman that looks exactly like his grandma. And originally, he thought it was his grandma. But then he said that in the cave, there's a lot of other things that look like people, but they're all robots and they're not moving. And he says after a while, he figures out that this woman really isn't his grandma, even though she's really nice to him and very polite, but he believes she's a robot as well.
She's got sparks around her head or something like that?
Yeah, he made some kind of comment about, there was some kind of light or sparks or unusual light coming from her head. And then he says that she was real nice until she started to get pushy, and she took out some sticky paper and laid it on the ground and told him he had to poop on it. And he told her that he didn't have to go, and she got mad. And he says, now, as I'm sitting there, he says, they asked him, what else did you see there? And he said he saw a lot of small guns and things around the outside perimeter of the cave, and they all had a lot of dust on them. So then you kind of fast forward a little bit, and the boy went to go spend time at that grandmother's house the following weekend. And he tells the story to the grandmother. Well, the grandmother then told us that 3 weeks before the boy disappeared, the grandmother and her husband were at that exact creek, river, spending the night. And they actually woke up in the middle of the night because the grandmother felt a pain at the base of her neck, and she had her husband look, and there was a small bloody spot at the base of the neck. And she says, I don't know if it's related, but I just wanted to tell you that I thought that was strange. I happened to be there where this point he disappeared, and he sees a grandmother, and I have this bloody spot on my neck. I don't know what to think of it. Make a long story short, the boy's fine. He's developing fine. He hasn't disappeared anymore. But that is probably the most unusual story that I've ever heard about a small boy disappearing.
Yeah, it's like Granny had a DNA sample taken from her when she was there before. I mean, I don't want to get too weird about it, but that's what it sounds like.
That's what we thought.
How many other cases, for those who haven't heard your previous interviews, how many other cases do you have where children are able to come back, they're alive, and they're able to give some kind of clue about where they've been? I know you don't have any exactly like that, but you do have some other versions of pretty weird tales.
It's very, very unusual. There are a very small group of cases where a child comes back or they're found and they tell unusual stories. There's some from the East Coast where the person says, I saw this giant thing standing behind a tree, and it was kind of swaying back and forth, and then I don't really remember much, and then you kind of found me. Other times there's a story out of, I think it was Arizona, where three kids disappeared from a picnic ground, and they were gone for a day and a half, and when the searchers finally found them, they walked up on them, and the kids immediately went down and were hiding. Searchers walked up to him and said, "What are you doing? Why are you hiding?" And he says, "We thought you might have been the 8 people again."
Let's go to talk about some of the new clusters that you discuss in this Volume 3. Mount Rainier National Park. I mean, these are as good as stories as you've had in any of the books, and I think our listeners up in Washington State are going to be pretty spooked by it. Go ahead and tell us a few of these tales.
Well, I think one of the best ones, and we got through a Freedom of Information Act request, we got the case file on this person, and his name was Joseph Wood, Jr., 34 years old. Disappeared July 8th, 1999. This person is unusual, and in the thousands of cases we've reviewed, this is only the second black man that I've ever written about that's disappeared under the criteria we've set down. Joseph was a super, super smart guy, Yale graduate, Eagle Scout. He was an editor for a New York newspaper. Then he moved on and was a publishing editor at a publishing company. And he was in Seattle for a conference. And during one of the days, they had a break, and so he decided to go to Mount Rainier and do some bird watching. He was an outdoor enthusiast and a bird enthusiast. And he went to a place called Longmire Parking Lot, parked his rental car on a beautiful day, and sat down on a very, very large trail and started to hike up. And it was a nice day. There was still some snow on the ground. And as he's walking up the trail, he comes across another bird watcher. And they stop and they talk to each other, and they have a great conversation. They kind of compare notes. This guy says, "This is how far you can go up the trail, and then there's going to be too much snow." And it wasn't that much further. And Joe said, "Good." And they separated. He walked further up. That was the last time he was ever seen. And again, an established trail in good weather, in the middle of the week, broad daylight, disappeared. Huge search. What I tell people about Joseph is that not only was he a brilliant guy, but he was also an Eagle Scout. And I think that's the first Eagle Scout I've ever written about as well. And Eagle Scouts are trained in the outdoors. They have to do good in their lessons, otherwise they never reach that rank. And you have to have a certain amount of common sense to reach that level as well. And that area of Mount Rainier that he disappeared in isn't one of the most rugged areas of the mountain. It's a pretty mundane area. And searchers were able to track down that witness he saw, and he said there was nothing unusual. It was a great conversation. He was upbeat. We talked about the birds, etc. So anyhow, after about a 10-day search, the Park Service was ready to call it off, and his family and a newspaper in New York called The Village Voice wrote an article about it, his disappearance. And again, just like we've talked about earlier, abduction comes into the scenario. And abduction comes in because searchers and family members have a difficult time reconciling what happens to these people. If somebody disappears, chances are they're going to start dropping things when they get stressed. So in Joe's case, he might drop his book, he might drop his map, he might drop a backpack, whatever he's carrying. In these instances, they find nothing. It's so strange. And in Joe's case, they never found anything. They never found his body. They never found his coat, books, maps, nothing. And so a very, very unusual case. But as we sort of suspected about Rainier years ago, the more we got into it, the more strangeness went into it. And when you talk about the abduction scenario, you don't really think about abductions on the side of the mountain or abductions when people are hiking. You tend to think of abductions around parking lots maybe, or around populated areas near a lodge. But on a trail where there's only two cars in the parking lot, Joe's and the guy he saw on the trail, the idea that an abduction is going to occur there, almost unheard of. And how that could have been accomplished, that's the million-dollar question. And it wouldn't have been in a time of the year when weed was growing up on the mountain. That wouldn't have been it. And guaranteed there wouldn't be anybody with a meth lab on the side of the mountain because it's normally way, way too cold. So it's a big, giant whodunit. And
you had another disappearance on Mount Rainier, a little girl. This was a long time ago, not as recent as the Joseph Wood case, but a little girl, 4-year-old girl, who was found alive.
Yeah, and there are so many of those little kids, say under the age of 6 or 7, that vanish in that exact scenario, that it's actually on our end. It gets to be, you get to be numb to it. But the reality of it is, when she disappeared, she shouldn't have disappeared. She was in close proximity to her parents, and she's found again uphill from where she passed, from where she was lost. But and her name was Marcella Romiski back in 1950. She was 4 years old. But I like to talk about things that are really, really abnormal. And there was a guy named Eric Lewis. I don't know if you remember that one. It disappeared in July of 2010. 57 years old, absolutely phenomenal shape, climbed as a career all over the world, and was climbing with some super experienced climbers on the side of Rainier. And they were doing some technical climbing high up. They were pulling each other up, and Eric was on the other end, and all of a sudden the line kind of goes loose. So they pull it up, and the carabiner at the other end is there, but there's no rope attached to it. So they decide they'll go down, and because they're yelling for him and they're not getting anything, and they can't see him. And we're talking about nothing unusual here. They're climbing the mountain. A guy's attached to the line. He's over the side of the cliff. He didn't fall. There's no screaming or yelling. There's nothing. They looked for him. They called in the National Park climbing team. This guy was never found. And he was attached, and they were starting to pull. The rope went limp. The carabiner's attached to the other end. Eric's gone and never seen again.
You say in the book that he was among the top 1% climbers in the world.
per the National Park Service climbers that were there. They said he knew that mountain better than most of the professionals that climb it.
He would have had to have disconnected the rope himself on purpose, almost.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't break because it was never attached, and they said it made absolutely no sense.
I don't want to backtrack too much, but I wanted to just to mention that one of the reasons I brought up the case of Marcella, that 4-year-old girl we were talking about a moment ago, is when she was found alive, we had talked about clothing that was weird. Her dress was on backwards, and there was something weird about the laces of her shoes.
Exactly, and her mother made that observation and said, she doesn't even know how to dress herself that way, and she doesn't know how to tie her shoes. And they were tied in a way that she had never seen. The entire thing didn't make sense, but it did make some sense when you look at the clothing and the shoe issue that we've seen on many other cases. They're off or they're gone.
Let's jump forward. I mentioned about Steve Thomas. This is a guy who went hiking with 5 of his friends in the Adirondacks, northern New York, and vanished. What's unusual about that case? This is from 1976.
This is one of those really fascinating cases where all of these guys were outdoors people. They were on a break from a community college, Onondaga Community College. Steve was 19 years old, and they were on the side of a mountain called Mount Marcy, and they had stopped at a place called Hopkins Lean-To to kind of spend the night, put up their tents, and have fun. And it was the 5 buddies and their dog. And as they're getting all their things together to camp out for the night, Steve says, hey, I'm just going to walk up this trail a little more. I'll be right back. I'm just going to get my legs going again. And he walked out of sight wearing a yellow rain slicker. And it was the last time anybody ever saw him. He was in a good state of mind. He was having fun. Nothing strange, unusual to him physically or mentally. He didn't have any disabilities. At about 10 p.m., they started to get really nervous because bad weather was coming into the area, wind, rain, and some light snow. The guys got out, walked up the trail a little bit, yelling for him, screaming for him, looking for him, nothing. They came back into their tent, and as they originally tried to leave, they tried to bring the dog with them, and the dog wouldn't leave the tent. And when they came back to the tent, the dog was whining and would not move from the inside of the tent. Now, flash forward a few weeks, Steve had a brother named Bob Thomas, and Bob actually committed his life to trying to find Steve. And the rangers in that area said Bob Thomas knows Mount Marcy better than anybody. And the following summer after Steve disappeared, Bob and his dog were out searching, and they actually found the body of another climber named Buddy Atkinson. And his dog started to dig through the snow, and they found this guy who'd been dead for a couple years. That's how thorough Bob and the search group was in looking for Steve. Steve's never been found. He's one of a group of people in this area of the Adirondacks that disappears, is missing, you find nothing. One thing about this case that we haven't talked about before, that is bright-colored clothing. And I've written about that in the other books, and there seems to be a correlation to people who wear bright colors and they disappear.
Yeah, that's a pretty weird aspect. Let's jump to, I promised that we'd talk a little bit about foreign countries. Canada, you've got some amazing cases all the way across from British Columbia to Nova Scotia. Which of the Canadian cases do you think are best exemplify this mystery and jump out at you?
There's a case out of the western area of Canada involving a lady that was a lookout tower fire spotter, and her last name was Stewart, Stephanie Stewart. She was an older lady. She was in her 70s. She'd been doing the job for decades, and she was in the tower. This is an isolated road up and down to it. This is I wrote about in the Western book, and in the middle of the night, she disappeared, and somebody came up to see her, and she was gone. And Stephanie, again, was an older person in good health, but she wasn't the type of person that could really or would really get out and start moving around. She had water on the stove. What was missing were the most unusual things: her blanket and her alarm clock in her room. And some people may say, well, a rogue killer drove up that road, kidnapped her, and took her. But from a law enforcement perspective, that would be the last thing that a serial killer or a murderer would do. Because this road going up there is like 6 or 7 miles long. It's a dirt road, one way up, one way down. If you're a killer, you don't want to be taking a road like that because there's too much of a chance someone's going to see you and spot you and identify you. And it just doesn't make sense. They searched for her for days, and they never found anything. All of a sudden after that, the Canadian Natural Resources Group started to change the way they did things with lookout people. And, we started to look at lookout towers in the United States as well. And there's a lot of weird things that have happened around those towers at night and during the day that I can't say are directly related to Stephanie's disappearance, but they go to show that there's a lot of unusual events that happen around them.
What is the level of cooperation that you get from Canadian authorities, or have you even tried to see if they have records? Do they keep records about disappearances in parks, for example?
That's a great, great question. And they have something very similar to our Freedom of Information Act, but they only respond to Canadian citizens. Luckily, I got a couple of buddies that are Canadians, and they do the dirty work for us. And phenomenally, they don't carry those records either.
Back to Pennsylvania, kids mostly disappeared, but you have a case of Marjorie West. Tell me about that one.
And Marjorie is one of those cases I was just talking about that disappeared on the northern side of this wilderness designation in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania. She was with her family, and her dad was fishing in a small creek. Mom was sitting in a car. Girls were picking wildflowers. And she got out of sight just momentarily. And prior to that, her dad had said, hey, don't play by those big boulders because there's sometimes snakes there. And her sister thought that she walked over by this boulder. And it was one of those brief, and she's gone. And right around where Marjorie disappeared, there's another boy disappeared probably within 15 miles under equally strange circumstances and was never found. Absolutely a huge search for these people and absolutely nothing. No clothing, no nothing. And Marjorie's case played headlines for a number of months. And it's just one of those perplexing things that a few seconds out of your sight. And these boulders come up many times when you're in the woods. Either evidence is found in or near them, or people are in amongst them, and something happens. And going back to Yosemite real quick, Yosemite's covered by miles and miles of huge granite and exposed granite. And a lot of times these people are disappearing in amongst areas where there isn't a lot of cover. There's a lot of boulders. It's an interesting dilemma to think about.
Let's talk about Douglas Legg. I know that was a case that really got under your skin.
So Douglas and Dennis have a lot of similarities in my mind. So Douglas Legg, he was from New York, and his uncle was a banker from New York and very wealthy man. His name was Crandall Melvin. This occurred in July of 1971 in an area called Newcomb, New York. And it happened at Newcomb Lake, and his family owned a 13,000-acre estate that essentially surrounded this lake in a beautiful area. And the family went there to vacation with other members of the extended family. And Douglas was with his uncle, and they were going to go on a small hike. And he came out, and he was dressed inappropriately. And his uncle told him, hey, you got to go back to the lodge and change. And the lodge was in sight. And some kids were in the lake, and they were yelling at Douglas, hey, come on, blah, blah, blah. And he was talking to him, and he walked off and around a small ridge where his uncle was waiting and headed towards the lodge. And make a long story short, he never made it back to the lodge, and he was never seen again. And this is in a long driveway up to this lodge. Nobody comes up here. It's very restricted, just family. Nobody's there 90% of the time. There's some swamps in the upper northern reaches of the property, and there's an area called the High Peaks area as you're going towards Lake Placid. Very rough, very rugged area. Dennis disappears, and the family pulls everything out that they can to find this boy. Douglas disappears. The family pulls everything out to find the boy. And they make a call to California for some special canines and special search and rescue teams, and they fly him in. And Douglas had been gone a couple days at this point, and it appears as though private planes were probably used to get these people out so quick. They put him on the ground, and the dogs start searching. And nobody can believe what the dogs are doing. They're walking north, but they're not walking a little north. They're going way north. They're headed straight into this High Peaks area, super rugged, difficult even for the trackers to keep going through this area. And they walk up to one of the highest peaks in that area, over the top, and they keep going through swamps, through boulder fields, through everything. Eventually, they get to the western side of the city of Lake Placid, but they're on the perimeter of the town in the hills or mountains surrounding it. And the dogs go all the way around the perimeter of the town and back down the other side. And that's where they walk up to this giant swamp, and the dogs sit down, and that's it. Everyone kind of stops. And the search and rescue people couldn't believe it, but they said, hey, they are 100% positive the dogs were on the scent. And it was an unbelievable, almost 30-mile perimeter that they walked, and they couldn't believe that they were still on it for a little 8-year-old boy. And there's no way that they thought that the boy could have survived going up and down these mountains, because they figured it had to have taken them a week or more to make this round, because that's what it was taking them every day. They didn't make this quickly. It was a hard, hard path. And it's one of those searches that everyone was dumbfounded. Well, at the time that the search teams were called out from California, this is one of the only other times I've ever heard this, Green Berets come out. Green Berets land. Green Berets set up their own camp, and they start searching on their own. Don't talk to anybody. And they're working through the wilderness on their own. So whatever their mission was, other than to find Dennis, who knows, because they didn't talk to anybody. And they weren't working with other searchers, just like in Dennis's case. They were working alone, through the forest, by themselves. And that just doesn't fit with what you think about search and rescue teams. And when I talked about this at the conference up in this year, people couldn't believe it. They've never heard of something like this, where groups weren't working together to find somebody. It's as though they were on their own private mission that no one understood. The idea that Green Beret is used to find a missing boy is really unusual. And in all the cases I researched, the Legg and Martin cases stand out because of this.
Was it in the same time frame as the Martin case?
Well, Martin was 69, Legg was 71.
Makes you wonder if it's the same Green Beret unit.
It certainly does.
There's a case that jumps out at me in the new book, The Missing 411 North America and Beyond, because it happened right near, maybe a couple of miles from where I was born. It's in New Jersey. And it's not exactly the same as the other cases. This didn't happen in some national forest. But it's perplexing, and it, too, involves a dog, the little girl in the closet. Tell me that story.
This girl, Mary Jane Barker, 3 years old, she was playing in her backyard on February 25th, 1957, in the morning hours. And she was in a place called Bellmawr, Bellmawr, New Jersey, and it's just across the river from Philly. And her mom came out, looked at her. She's playing in the backyard with her Cocker Spaniel. Her mom comes out 5-10 minutes later. The dog's gone. The girl's gone. And she can't believe it because she thought she had everything locked up solid. And she looked in the back, the creek, didn't see anything, started to get some neighbors together. They searched. They quickly called the police. The police come out. And essentially 3 days of searching, and the police start to bring up this word kidnapping again. Now, the dog's gone and the girl's gone. So they start to spread out more, and they bring in some professional trackers. And on that fourth day, they think that they see an area in that creek bed, and they think they see some tracks of a large man with a dog and a child. They're not sure, but they think so. So we're going into the sixth day now, and this is an area that's not really developed yet. There's a few houses scattered in the area, not a lot. And 2 blocks away, people were building a new house. Now, you got to remember, the area out probably a mile has been searched 5 or 6 times. These houses that are being built have been searched 5 or 6 times. Well, the house was going up for sale, and a mom and a daughter, unknown to the victim's family, was inside this new house looking at it. And this little girl opens up a closet door, and Mary Jane's dog bolts out of the closet and jumps on the little girl. And inside the closet is Mary Jane, deceased. So they call on the sheriff. They do an autopsy, and it shows that Mary Jane hadn't eaten anything for 6 days. But the strange thing about this is the police chief confirmed that house in that area had been searched 3 times minimum. And the very odd thing is that there was no excrement inside that closet from a dog or her. And the workers had said they had been in that house almost every day, and they never heard any sounds, and they never heard any barks, nothing. So the coroner thought initially, well, she just must have been in there, and he can't explain why there's no excrement. They actually brought in a veterinarian, and the veterinarian found out that the dog hadn't been trained about where to defecate or where not to, and he had absolutely no explanation why there was no excrement from the dog or anything in that closet. So the question comes up, was she in that closet for 6 days? Was the dog in that closet for 6 days? And if they weren't, where were they, and how long had they been in there?
And how searchers would have missed them as well.
Well, that's a common theme that you'll see, and trust me, I am not saying that the searchers are missing these people. I don't believe it, because in a large percentage of the cases we turn here is that people make the statement, but we searched this area 5 times. We searched this area 10 times. We searched this area 50 times, and they weren't there. They come back the 51st time. There they are.
It's as if the victims are taken, they're taken somewhere else, and then they're brought back and sort of dumped.
Kind of the way it appears.
All right, David, before the break, I was asking you whether you succeeded in developing any confidential sources who had worked for the Park Service, and you were telling me about one particular cluster. Pick up the story from there.
So this is in Crater Lake, and a document that we discovered talked about one of the park rangers that had found a body out in the middle of the wilderness after this 19-year-old kid had disappeared. Again, this guy's name was Charles McCullough. He visited the lake by himself, went there to photograph it during the winter. This happened in February of 75, and he disappeared. And at the time, his dad was on the East Coast, came out to Crater Lake, looked around, had the help of the Park Service, and was completely befuddled that his son could disappear in this lake at that time. In Crater Lake, imagine it as a giant volcano filled with water. You can't go down to the lake during the winter. The sides are very steep. There's 20-foot drifts of snow. It's an absolutely gorgeous place, but dangerous at the same time. So we found the name of a ranger. His name was Marion Jack, and Marion was a science teacher outside of Medford during the school year. And at the end of the school year, he went to the Law Enforcement Training Academy for the feds, became a law enforcement park ranger, and every summer he would take his family up to Crater Lake, and they would live there for the summer, and he was one of their law enforcement officers. Well, when McCullough disappeared, McCullough's dad came out, and he described for the Park Service the things that Charles should have with him. And there were some unusual things. First of all, there was a lot of camera equipment, a small backpack, a key for a Volkswagen, a very distinct type of Volkswagen key, and some other things. Well, a little more than a year after Charles disappears, about 12 miles from the point where he was at the lake, in the middle of the wilderness, and I mean in the middle of nowhere, some hikers are in a box canyon where a small creek goes in, and they see what they think is a skeleton. They eventually make their way out, and they bring some stuff with them that they found in the area. And what they found was a backpack, and they open the backpack with the help of Marion and some other rangers, and they find this key, and right away they know that this is McCullough. So Marion, one of his jobs was to bring his horses up there for the summer, and he was one of the equestrian rangers. And so him and another ranger ride into this site, and he describes it as a long, rigorous, tough ride to get back in there. And making note, he said in February of 75, there were special notes in the report that there were 20-foot drifts of snow around the perimeter of the lake, making it literally impossible for anybody to get into the wilderness from the point that McCullough disappeared. Where he was found was in a canyon sort of thing with a small creek, not a big creek, very small, that ran in. And he said, I walked up to it. I ended up finding Marion, who lives in southern Oregon, absolutely the greatest guy in the world, the kind of person you'd want being a park ranger. And he said, Dave, it's phenomenal that you were asking me about this case, because in 30 years of doing this, this is the strangest event I ever saw in my life. He says, myself and another guy walked into the canyon, and there was a large Douglas fir tree kind of branching the creek. And we walked up to it, we kind of looked over the other side, and on the other side was a sight I'll never forget. And he said, imagine, Dave, that you're standing up and you melted into your jeans, your blue jeans. And he said, what we looked at was even more amazing, and that is that the jeans were sitting down on the bank, just like you would melt into them, except a more unusual sight. The pants were unbuttoned, and the belt was undone. And he said the socks were inside the jeans as though they should be, and there were small bones in the socks as there should be, and there was one tibia on the right leg, that's the bone between the knee and the foot, which was broken, and there were no other bones. And he says, but a more disturbing sight, Dave, was that there were no boots. And he says, I've recovered dozens and dozens of bodies in the middle of the woods, and we always find the boots, because the boots don't blow away, animals don't take the boots, and there's something that can last 100 years. He says, but there's no boots. And he said, but the pants were there, but there's no shirt, there's no boots, there's no coat, there's no camera. He was carrying a knife, there's no knife, there's no nothing, except these small bones and a bone from a right knee. So in a circular pattern moving out from that area, they found the top of his skull 12 feet away, and a series of small bones, probably no bigger than an inch in circumference, around the entire area. Now, Marion says, Dave, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Something's wrong here. First of all, how McCullough got to this location in the middle of winter makes no sense. And what he's looking at right there makes zero sense. So what the rangers are taught to do in rural areas is call for an FBI ERT team, and that's an evidence response team, and they come from either Eugene or they come from Portland. So they secure the scene, they radio for an ERT team to come in and work this scene. So the FBI responds by helicopter with a group, and they end up working the scene for 4 days, Marion says. And he says, I know that the agents were befuddled, and everyone was wondering what was going on. And he goes, there were never really any good answers, Dave. But he says, FOIA the FBI and get the report. So I FOIA the FBI, and they send me some redacted report where you couldn't read 25 words on the whole page, and then they wouldn't send me the report on the crime scene or the crime scene diagrams. And what they did, and they do this every time, is they say that it would violate the privacy rights. I said, no, wait a minute. The person's dead. What privacy rights are we concerned about here? And the guy says, hey, that's our policy. You're not going to get it. I said, okay. So hold that thought for a minute regarding the open pants and the zipper down and the belt buckle undone. And if that's not strange enough, you would probably never hear this next point again in your life. So I asked Marion, I said, Marion, what do you make of this? She said, David, makes no sense to me. The kid couldn't have gotten there in the middle of winter as far as we're concerned. He didn't have any snowshoes. He didn't have any skis. He didn't have anything for winter. And even if he did, I don't think he could have made it that far into the wilderness in the winter. There's no way.
That's very strange. Since you're into the discussion of cases, let's start with the first one you mentioned in the book, and you already made a reference to it. This is something that happened in the Yukon Territory, and it's one of the cases that really got you hooked on it.
Yeah, Bart Schleyer. Bart was a guy who is a mountain man to the max, but he's a smart guy. He was raised in the woods. His dad was a physician, but took Bart all over the world, to Africa hunting. He ended up working for the state of Montana in their bear program, tagging and releasing bear. He was in phenomenal condition. He actually went to Russia at one point and helped them tag and release bear. If there was anybody out there that was going to survive in the woods under any condition, it was Bart. And he always would look for more and more challenges. And he ended up going to the Yukon and the capital up there called Whitehorse. And this happened to be a story that riveted me because I've been to the Yukon a number of times. And it's very remote in certain regions. There's not a lot of ground cover in certain areas. Some areas of the Yukon have great fishing, some have no fish. Some areas have lots of moose, some have no moose. And Bart went to an area and was flown in. He set up a camp, brought supplies, and Bart would never hunt with a gun in North America. He always hunted with a bow and arrow. And he set up on the other side of the lake, and it appeared as though he was hunting for moose. Now, at about this time, I told a buddy of mine that owns a lodge up in the Yukon, I said, hey, do you know anybody in the western region of the Yukon that worked for natural resources? And my buddy of mine was a hunting and fishing guide, and he said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. And he put me onto a man that had worked in the Yukon for 35 years, and son of a gun, he was on Schleyer's crime scene, and they put me in touch with him. This guy said, Dave, son of a gun, 35, you hear this more and more, but he says, son of a gun, that's the strangest scene I've ever been in my life. He goes, where did you ever hear about this? I told him, it's through some work. Some friends told me that Bart had disappeared, and they were concerned. He said, concerned, this is one of the most peculiar cases I'm ever going to tell you about. He said, we got there because the pilot pulled up to pick Bart up and couldn't find him. And he had the creeps. And he left, and he told RCMP. So the RCMP come in there, and they did a superficial job and left, like less than an hour and a half. Yeah, they saw his stuff. Nothing was disturbed. The food was still there. Bears didn't attack the food. Nothing. They couldn't find him, and they left. Some of Bart's friends pay for a guy to fly him in there, and what they found disturbed them so much that they left. They got a contingent of RCMP, came back, and started to search the scene. So what happened was the search shows that Bart was probably sitting on this utility bag up near a tree, probably with his bow and arrow, waiting for a moose, calling it in. And somehow or another, something took him from behind. That's the assumption. So he was wearing a baklava over his head, and the baklava was found 25, 30 feet from the main area he was in, no blood on it. A pair of pants that he was wearing was found near the scene, turned inside out, no blood, no bite marks on it. The entire area was very similar to what I just explained about McCullough. They found almost nothing of Schleyer other than little teeny bones, a few teeth. That's about it. And the individual that I interviewed from the resources group in the Yukon said, Dave, first of all, bears in the Yukon don't eat their victims. They may attack them, but in 35 years, I never remember a bear actually consuming somebody to this point. The other point was that they found bear scat in the area. It was tested. There was no human remains in it, and there was no clothing in it. So Schleyer's coat was gone. His gloves were gone. His shirt was gone. His pants were there. His boots were gone. And it was one of the biggest whodunits in the Yukon's history. And the more important point, and initially people will say, oh, a bear ate him or something, but there was food at the campsite that wasn't disturbed. And the resource guy could not say that it was a bear. He said, Dave, I don't think it was a bear, but I don't know what did do it.
There's a case you mentioned about a guy named an older kid, 17 years old, Corey Fay. This is Oregon, I think, or maybe it was Washington. That was very disturbing, very unusual in a lot of ways. What jumps out at you about this case?
Yeah, that is one of those cases where a rational thought doesn't come to your mind when you think about Corey. He was a hunter, and he was with another group, and there were some innuendos on that case where there might have been some foul play involved. But I really, in looking at this case, I don't think so, because it falls within the realm of everything else we've talked about: location, altitude, etc. So Fay's hunting, and a lot of these people disappear while they are elk hunting. And elk hunting seems to be one of those things, for whatever reason, that a lot of people disappear. And, it could be weather, maybe not, but in Corey's case, it wasn't. He was 17 at the time. He had hunted a few times. He was well-equipped. And he was hunting right there on the Oregon-Washington border. He disappears. They have a massive search. Wasco County sheriffs come in. The Rocky Mountain Search and Rescue Team actually came out from Salt Lake. And across a ridge line, they find a series of tracks much higher than where Corey should have been. And it had started to snow at that time, and they saw the tracks on this ridge line. And it was perplexing to everybody involved why Corey would be on the top of the ridge in a snowstorm when all he had to do was look at the valley below and see there was no snow. It would make sense that you would go lower in elevation to get warmer. And during that time that searchers were working, they heard some unusual things around the area. There were some sounds that they couldn't. Initially, they thought it was screams, but then sometimes they would get some kind of faint response going back and forth. And it was confusing to searchers because initially they thought it might be Corey, but then later on they said it couldn't have been. And they eventually went out and they found a tooth that they thought was Corey's, and that's about all that they recovered. And this was after a massive search, and it was perplexing because it falls into that realm where they also didn't find any boots. And again, like I've said before, boots are heavy. Where were Corey's boots? And no skull. There were very few bones, one tooth. And as I said in the book, this case falls in line with Schleier's case and Huggins' case up in Ontario and McCullers' case in the Crater Lake area. And if you read some search and rescue logs and some news articles on this event, they try to point to a possible crime that occurred out there. Maybe he was shot and killed and things. But when you understand the crime scene and you compare this crime scene to others that I've described, there starts to be some parallels. The other parallel in this event, along with many others I describe in both books, is at the time that the person disappears, the weather is okay. And soon after the disappearance, and I'm talking real soon, sometimes within hours, the weather turns really, really bad. And right away, I mean, a lot of listeners will think, okay, well, that kind of went along with the search and rescue problems and why the person wasn't found. Well, in Corey's case, he went up higher in elevation than he should have been, and common sense would have said he should have been coming down. And where the location where they found the tooth and some other things, it doesn't make any rational sense in the least. And in the book, I tell people, well, in Corey's case, there's no boots, socks, pants. Why would he remove his coat? He was a search and rescue trained person that in inclement weather he knew what to do. He walked 3 miles, they figure, in waist-deep snow on a ridgeline when he could have walked downhill and gotten warmer. Why would he be 10 miles? He was eventually found 10 miles from where he should have been and where he should have met up with his friends. And the other point of this that never made any sense is that the sheriff told the news people that came to cover this that he didn't think there was any crime. So what he did do is he calls the FBI in the middle of this, and they start to help out and look around, and what's called monitoring the case, but not essentially taking the case. but there's never anything discussed other than that. And I think it might be a good point to tell the listeners that many of these cases, the FBI shows up and monitors the case. And this is an important point because the FBI has some of the best profilers in the world that take all of the information that is found at a scene. And it doesn't have to be, per se, a crime scene, an unusual scene. And they take this and they put it in a database and they search it when they need to. And maybe one time finding just bones or small bones won't be important. But the 10th or the 11th time, it starts to put together a series of events that are unusual. Now, the FBI lists on their website the cases they handle and the cases they won't handle. And they don't handle missing persons cases. But unusually, one category is unusual disappearances of children. Now, why would that be something? And when you look at the massive amounts of cases that I've listed in these books, where there's a consistency in the elements of what happened and how they were found, what I write is I say, the FBI are some of the best profilers in putting information together and putting a string together so it makes sense. We'll never see this. But every time an FBI agent goes on a scene, even though they're just monitoring, they're writing a report, and that's going in. That's going into their database for more knowledge later on. These people are brilliant at doing these things, and they know much more about everything I'm talking about than you and I will ever know about what they're monitoring. And
we're going to go to a break. I'm sorry, we're going to go to a break in about 2 minutes. I'd like to ask you this, and I know maybe it's not enough time to. Does it seem like something is eating these people? I mean, you mentioned about the bone fragments and the skulls and the kinds of remains that are found in some of the cases. Many of the cases, nothing is found. And the clothes, all that stuff. Does it seem like they're being consumed just by no kind of animal that we know of?
Some search and rescue people and some woodsmen will say, small animals ate the bones and broke them up into small pieces like that. Other people say, no, that's not happening, and that's not what is going to happen here. And because the pants are turned inside out and the way that the remains were scattered in a confined area doesn't make sense. So some woodsmen would say no, some would say yes, but the people that were on the scene, the experienced people, when they start to call an evidence response team, I don't think that's normal.
Well, and when you talk about the FBI, what has been the response from them in terms of when you've tried to get records through FOIA?
They are the worst of the worst. They will give you essentially nothing.
On the grounds that maybe it's still an open case, or what's the reason they use?
Even if the person's deceased, what they're saying is, and it doesn't make any sense, is that they'll violate the privacy rights of the victim.
Oh, that's right.
And it completely befuddles you. How could they have privacy rights? They're deceased.
We're talking with David Paulides about his book, Missing 411. When we come back, we get into some of the California clusters, in particular Mount Shasta, which is where we'll start. A lot of weird stories about Mount Shasta over the years. They're about to get weirder. Stay with us, everyone. A lot more to come on Coast to Coast AM. David, let's talk about Mount Shasta. A lot of weird stories over the years, Lemurians and underground cities and things of that sort, flying saucer sightings, all kinds of strangeness. But you've been able to find in focusing on disappearances that strange things have been going on there for a long time. There was a whole cluster back in the 1800s, right?
Yeah, so the cluster is defined in our mind as a geographical cluster up to a 100-mile radius. And there's a consistent thread that runs through those disappearances. We'll talk about 60 miles west of Mount Shasta as you go towards the coast. There's a small town called Gasquet. It's Gasquet, French name. And in the old days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a series of miners that had 50 to 100 mines scattered throughout the perimeter of the Marble Mountain Wilderness area and the region bordering Oregon. So in the late 1800s, everyone sort of kept track of everybody. And slowly, the miners started to disappear. And I don't mean they came into town and they dropped their belongings, sold them, and took off. I mean they disappeared. People would find the mine but there was nobody there. Their belongings were there. Their guns were there. They were gone. And there were up to 30 of these miners that disappeared in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were never found. No graves. They weren't robbed. They were gone. And this was noted in the Crescent Valley newspaper at the time, and as an oddity. So you fast a lot of the clusters that I write about. There's a historical tie, as there is in Crater Lake, to disappearances. This isn't a phenomenon that's just occurred in the last 10 years. This has usually occurred over a long-term period of time. So in the Mount Shasta cluster, it's tied to this coastal region near Gasky where the miners vanished. Well, in Mount Shasta, there's two highly, highly unusual events that occurred in 1999 and in 2000. And they both involved older people, a guy named Carl Landers, who was 69, and an individual named Rosemary Kunst, who was 70. Different events, different locations. Carl was with some buddies that he had known for a number of years, and they wanted to climb Mount Shasta. And understand that Mount Shasta is climbed hundreds and hundreds of times, and you don't need to be a star athlete to do it. It's a tough climb, but you can do it. And Carl was with some friends, and one of them was a retired airline pilot who flew fighters or flew in the Air Force and was a really well-rounded person, and another individual who ran an import business out of San Francisco. So they left. They started to climb the mountain, and they stopped in an area where everyone stops before they make the final ascent, and it's in an area of a small lake. Well, that night they didn't quite make the lake. They set up their little tent in a little cove up against the mountain near some boulders. And they spent the night there sleeping away, and it got a little windy. And Carl wasn't feeling 100%. He had some diarrhea that they thought might be due to the altitude pills that he was taking for acclimating to the conditions. But he left the tent a couple of times for diarrhea. He came back, and early in the morning, he said he didn't feel good, but he could still make it. So even though these guys were older, they were pretty good athletes. Carl used to run every day, and he was a good athlete, although he hadn't made this climb before. Others with him had. So early in the morning, they're picking up the tent, and two of the guys who were picking up the tent told Carl, hey, go around the turn, go 800 feet, and you're going to hit the lake. Wait there, and we'll be right there. And if you understand the area, there's one very, very defined trail that runs along the side of Shasta that goes straight to the lake. There is nothing else you can do. There are no other choices. It is very evident where you're going, etc. Carl says, okay. The guys, 15, 20 minutes later, get the tent done. They take off. They head around the corner and go to the lake. They get to the lake, and there's a ranger assigned there because there's so many people that camp at this lake at night before they ascend. And he kind of keeps track of everybody. And they stopped at the ranger, and they said, hey, did you see this guy? And he says, no. They say, you sure? Well, there's only one guy that took off, and they saw this guy up the hill, and they knew that wasn't Carl. So they walked back and forth 3 or 4 times, and then one of them decided to go up the mountain a little further. Make a long story short, they finally give up, and by the way, Carl had left his supplies, along with a lot of other guys left their supplies with that tent in that area. So they went back, and all the tents and sleeping supplies were still at that area where they had left it. And so they decided, well, they better get some help. And so they called Shasta County Search and Rescue. They called California Search and Rescue. And a very grisly guy named Grizz Adams was running the search operations. He'd been doing this for 30 years. I spoke to Grizz about this personally. I met with him. And again, it's one of those times he goes, Dave, how did you ever hear about this story? This 35 plus years, I've never had this happen to me. He says, we were all over that mountain. He goes, Carl was not on the mountain, Dave. We brought canines in. They didn't pick him up. We flew it. We dropped guys at the summit, 14,000 plus feet. They came down all sides. They couldn't find him. They talked to people who were on the mountain. They didn't see him. They said, Dave, There's snow around the path where he was, and nobody went outside the path. I said, what happened to him, Gris? He says, Dave, it's $1 million question. He either went up or he went in, but he's not on it. And Carl Landers, to this day, has never been found. They never found a piece of his. He was carrying climbing equipment, boots, an axe, all the things that a climber would have who would go up Shasta. None of that stuff was ever found. His car was still at the bottom. It's one of the greatest whodunits ever found anywhere in that area. The other one involves a woman named Rosemary Kunst. Disappeared August 18th in 2000. She was 70 years old. Rosemary went through a pretty tough portion of her life. Her and her husband, a few years before that, were in an accident, and the husband died in the accident. She was looking for some type of spiritual retreat and getting into the mountains, and she found a Native American organization that gave tours up to a lake in the Marble Mountain Wilderness called Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake is a very gorgeous setting. Sits somewhat in a bowl area with a lot of trees on one end, no trees at the other end. Almost looks like, again, a little small volcano. And she went up there with a handful of other people and a Native American chief. And they went up there for, I forgot if it was 3 or 4 days. But during the time, the Native Americans would bring everyone to the altar at night, and they would sing spirit dances. And they would talk to the gods, and the people supposedly had this event happen to them where they can talk to their spirits, and she could reach out to her husband, etc. And the next day, after this event, the chief said that he was going to take a group over to another lake short distance away, and Rosemary said that she was going to stay behind. And the chief's son, who was 12 years old then, she asked the boy, hey, do you want to go with me over to the other side of the lake and have a picnic? And the boy says, no. Well, the cook that was there, she asked the cook if he would make her a lunch, and she would be back after she ate the lunch. He said, no problem. He made the lunch. She said goodbye to the boy, and she walked around this perimeter of the lake. Now understand, you and me and nobody else is going to walk outside the perimeter of this lake. The sides of it are very steep, rugged, etc. You stay inside the confines. There's no place to go. They all see her walk inside the bowl and go to the other side, and they lose her in a series of trees. 4 or 5 o'clock comes back. Everyone arrives back at camp, and Rosemary's not back. So they send a couple people out to look, and they don't find anything. It's like she was never there. And they come back. The Native American chief gets out a sat phone and calls for help. The cavalry arrives, and they start to search. And this is another Gris Adams search. Gris says, Dave, damn, these are the 2 times in my career where I have no answers. And he said, this woman, we talked to the family, she was mentally in great health. And this is the point that everyone should remember. She asked the boy to go with her to have the picnic, so you know that she was not suicidal. Even if she was suicidal, there's no place to go. If she drowned, they would have found her in the lake. She wasn't in the lake. She couldn't have gotten outside the confines, and even if she did, they would have found her because there's nothing but huge boulders on the other side. There's one outlet where the lake dumps into this small little ravine that's extremely steep going down the other side. And Gris said they had guys in mountain gear going down, looking inside boulders on this cliff. Dogs never reacted to anything. They couldn't find her. They never did find her. It's another one of those cases where there's nothing.
You've had great success in developing good, trusting relationships with Native Americans, the Hupa tribe that you investigated, Bigfoot sightings and things of that sort. I'm curious, and you just mentioned one particular Native American chief. Were you able to talk to them about the general premise? Is there anybody who gave you any insight into what the heck is going on? Do they have a take on it?
Well, that's a great question, and the chief that was running the event where the lady disappeared at Spirit Lake, Rosemary, he was equally perplexed, but he did say that he thought that Rosemary wanted to go back. And he said that there was a point where he was at the lake and 2 eagles flew over together, and to him that indicated that she was back with her husband. And I said, well, where do you think she went? And he said, I think she went to a place called Devil's Back Mountain, which brings up a another point that I talk about in both books. There's a lot of there are several times where people disappear in an area where it has a strange name. And for anyone who knows a lot about the mountains or mapping, locations on maps get names for a reason. And, if it's Mill Creek, there's probably a mill on that creek at one time. If it was Frank's Pass Creek, well, Frank Pass may have lived on that creek 100 years ago. Well, there's a couple times in this book, well, many times, where Devil's Valley, Devil's Mountain, Devil's Nest, these are the places where people are disappearing. And I say in the book, the reason it has that name is for a reason. And I don't understand the reason most of the time, but I do know that these names come up way too frequently. And when the chief said that Rosemary just disappeared and probably went to Devil's Back Ridge, I'm thinking, wow, is that coincidental?
Hold that thought. We want to continue with that particular episode, as well as the strange death of a lady who appeared to have been sexually molested, perhaps after she was dead there in Yosemite. David, could you finish up the story you were telling about the one disappearance in Yosemite and then briefly touch on another weird case there, Evelyn Roseman?
Yeah, I was going right into Roseman, and so she disappeared in October of '68. She was from San Francisco, and she was visiting with some friends. She liked to hike. She went out for a hike one day on October 19th, and she didn't come back. And what happened was Butch Farabee, who wrote about this case extensively, had a lot more insight into it than is publicly available. And what he talked about was that Evelyn was found at the base of Nevada Falls. And that in and of itself wouldn't have been unusual, except that in Butch's book, he states that she was launched from the top of the falls to where brain matter was found on boulders near the Merced River. So what that meant is that by falling, she couldn't have reached the location where her body was found, and somehow or another she was projected out so far that it was unreasonable to assume that fall could have come accidentally. And by launching it, it was hard for him to understand how a human could have launched something that far. And it took hours for them to figure out what happened, because after she fell or was launched, and after she hit the bottom, somebody or something took her and drug her a long distance away, 200-300 yards, and then lifted her shirt and caused extreme dry lacerations in her vaginal area, meaning she was raped. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that there was never any flyers put out in the park of any danger about this. Obviously, this is still an open case, and they wouldn't comply with FOIA and release it. It's still under investigation. But this occurred in '68, and there's never been any real progress on the case, and there are no suspects to the best that Butch or anyone else knew. This is an isolated case like this as far as anyone knows, but again, because they don't put out any data, it's hard to tell how far-reaching this is.
Let's go to another state, Vermont. You had a cluster in Vermont. You think of Vermont as a nice, peaceful place where nothing bad ever happens to anybody, but you've got some pretty dramatic cases from that area.
And it's just not a cluster, per se. It's a cluster in time and space, and it's one of the tightest clusters I write about in the books. And it's in the far southwestern corner of the state in the city of Bennington. And not only is it unusual because of the dates and the times, but the cases themselves are very weird. It's between 1926 and 1950. 7 people vanished. And first one I'll talk about is Paula Weldon, and she was going to a college there in Bennington. Good student, parents lived close by. She was doing a job in the dorm on a Sunday. Decided she was going to take a walk out to a place called Glastonbury Mountain. And she went out there, and people saw her on the hike up towards the top of the mountain. And they talked to her, and she asked how long it was going to take. She was by herself, and they lost sight of her. Well, people down at the bottom of the mountain later on, it wasn't too far later, heard screams. And the screams were coming from a lower portion of the mountain near a swamp area. Searchers went back into that area, and they smelled a foul odor near the area of the swamp that wasn't consistent with the swamp, and almost thought that it was a dead body smell, but they could never find it. To make a long story short, Paula was never found. But Glastonbury Mountain to the Native Americans has significance because there was a lot of evil things that happened in that area, and they didn't feel safe many times traveling through there. And we found that on a historical search. And there's other cases equally strange in Vermont involving people who die and are found in areas that don't make any sense at all, and they all fall within this 1926 to 1950 time frame, and then it's like something happened, the book was shut, nothing more happens.
I know you said I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the question is, there were 7 people I wrote about that disappeared in that time frame. Well, so why in those 24 years would this all of a sudden stop? And then you start to look at the time frames of the disappearances there versus in Pennsylvania, it went from 1929 to 1957. Vermont, it goes from 1926 to 1950. And you start to think, what was happening in that time period that caused all this chaos and kids disappearing? And then why all of a sudden would it have stopped?
We'll continue with our conversation with Dave Paulides, go into a couple of other areas, including the Deep South, Georgia, Arkansas, and then perhaps, with time allowing, into Michigan and a couple of other regions.